So, who knew 3 months ago, when we ungathered as a church family, that we would still be meeting in homes, gathered in small groups? You might be interested to know that we actually, every weekend, we have more people joining us online than what we had before we ungathered. And so we know we have a number of new friends from our community that we haven't had a chance to meet face to face yet. So hello, thanks for joining us, for tuning in once again. We also have people tuning in from different parts of the world, a number of people from Canada, and so it's good to welcome you as well. So I grew up in the earliest years of my life in the 60s. In fact, I barely made it into the 60s by 9 days. And we kind of have this idea of what the 60s were like. I barely remember it. But that's why there's the psychedelic background behind me, the kind of 60s look with the all you need is love pitch on the back, which is what we're naming this series, all that you really, really need in life, apparently, according to the Beatles, is love. Now, you might look at that with some skepticism, but there may be some truth as well. If you're a music lover, you recognize that song right away as coming from the 60s. You don't even have to be a rock music fan to know that that is a chart topper from the 60s. A little bit of background to the song, if you're interested. It's a song that was written by John Lennon in 1967. He was asked by the British government to submit a song to a global satellite TV special that was being done to recognize the reality of the chaos in the world. It was a world where there was a lot of chaos and wars and discontent, and a group of musicians and artists got together and said, let's do this thing on this relatively new idea of satellite television, and let's do this global event. And so this is what they did. In fact, it became the largest broadcast event of the 1960s. So as I said, this event was done in support of world peace, and in 1967, the world was in chaos. The Vietnam War was raging, and we had sent a lot of our good men to Vietnam, and they were coming back in wooden boxes and terribly injured. And there was opposition to that, and that was hurtful, and it was a really troubled time for our nation. There were other things that were happening in the world as well. 1967 would mark the Six-Day War in the Middle East, and the chaos that created. But on the home front, there were other things that were happening too that played into the kind of discontent that was sweeping the world, and particularly our nation. You might be surprised or interested to know that in 1967, there were racial tensions, particularly in the city of Detroit and in New Jersey, but in 159 cities across America, there were riots and looting and damage to property, and people were in the streets picketing racial inequality within our nation. In fact, in 38 states, the National Guard had been called out to try to bring peace and harmony into our country. The summer of 1967 became known as the long, hot summer of 1967 because of the tension that was there. At the same time, in San Francisco, in the Haight-Ashbury district of that city, there were 100,000 anti-establishment, peace-seeking beatniks, hippies, and cultural escapists descending on that city, and they formed this kind of countercultural community that offered free food, free drugs, free sex, because they did not want to participate in the culture. And they called it the Summer of Love. So you have this dichotomy going on. You have violence and chaos and people trying to find love and trying to find their way through it. And that's 1967. Does that in any way sound like the year 2020? Well, it was in the middle of that this song by the Beatles, All You Need Is Love, was recorded and became that chart topper. The lyrics are all about love. 24 times in this song, the word love is mentioned. All you need is love, all you need is love, all you need is love, love. Love is all you need. The song was released on June 25 of 1967. 3 days later, it was at the top of the charts globally. There was something about the wording of the song, something in it that attracted the attention of people. I think it was more than the lyrics, more than just the Beatles. They were already a popular group. There was something about the subject of love that touched a chord, as it always does. Now, the Beatles would probably never be mistaken as being theological giants. They might not even be considered as people who were particularly spiritual, though they might disagree. They weren't huge fans of the scriptures, and yet the lyrics of this song are so theologically online, the chorus in particular, that all the world really needs is love. All we need is love. One of the eyewitnesses in Jesus' life would have said something very, very similar. In fact, a number of them did. One of them records a time where Jesus spoke about this very subject matter as well. A religious guy comes to see Jesus one day, and he's educated, he's smart, I think he knows the answer to the question that he's going to ask, but he turns to Jesus and he says, Jesus, net out all of the commandments. Everything that's been written, all that God has told us, everything you've taught, just net it down, distill it out to one thing. What's the one thing, Jesus? What is it? And Jesus helps him out. He says, you must love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all of your soul, and all of your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And then, as a bonus, Jesus gives him something else, but it's not just a bonus. It is as if Jesus says, if you don't get the first one right, the second one isn't going to happen. But if you get the first one right, this is going to be a natural part of your life. He says, a second is equally important, and it's love once again. It's love your neighbor as yourself. On another occasion, Jesus is telling his guys they can find the life that they've really been looking for and hoping for, and a life that they can grasp and they can embrace. And what he called it is he called life in the kingdom is what he called it. And he tells them that if they're going to have that, it's going to be by recalibrating to a whole new operating system for their lives. In John 13, we read this. He says, now I am giving you, that's Jesus, I'm giving you a new commandment. Won't surprise you. Love each other. Just as I have loved you, you should love each other. A couple of months later, they would stand at the foot of a cross and look at Jesus dying from the cross, and they would go, you mean that's how much we're to love, based on what we see here? And then when Jesus wanted to explain to them how they would be recognized as his genuine followers, like what their signature, distinguishing characteristic would be, this is what he tells them in John 13. He says, your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. These friends that followed Jesus for 3 years grew up and became people who lived in kind of a rough and tumble world, and they had their own experiences that tested their love and tested their understanding of God's love for them. But one of them, toward the end of his life, John, interesting enough, the one that describes himself as the one that Jesus loved, sums up his story at the end of his life with these words. He says, dear friends, as if to say, okay, I'm going to go away, but here's the thing I want you to remember. Don't forget this. Let us continue to love one another, he says, for love comes from God. And then get this, anyone who does love is a child of God and knows God. It's as if to say, if you know God, you're going to naturally be a loving person. Interesting how John phrases that. And as if to punctuate and reinforce the importance of this, he adds this in the very next verse, but anyone who does not love, apparently that's possible. But it's possible because, as he says, you don't know God. Because God is love. God doesn't just love, he is love. And if you know love, it penetrates your mind, it penetrates your heart, and you will become a loving person. There's some profound depth to that truth right there. Well, another apprentice of Jesus, Peter, apparently saw things very much the same way as John did. He writes this toward the end of his life as he completes his memoirs. In 1 Peter 4, he says, most important of all, as if, again, like John, I'm going away, but I don't want you to forget. This is like net out everything I've taught you. Here's what it is. Of most important of all, continue to show deep love for one another. Forget this, for love Love covers over a multitude of sins, and you might even add infractions in relationships. Somehow love is this powerful, potent factor in that. And who can forget the things that some of you no doubt have heard about before? Paul, the Apostle Paul, who becomes a follower of Jesus well after these other guys are kind of shuffled off to other parts of the world. And Paul has this amazing experience with Jesus where he's overcome, well, as he'll tell it later on, he's overcome by the love that Christ has for him. After some time, he writes some instructions off to his protege, Timothy, and this is what he writes to Timothy. He says, the purpose of my instruction, in other words, Timothy, everything that I've taught you, we've been together, I've taught you some really important things, but of all the instructions I give you, I want you to know the purpose of them is that all believers would be filled with biblical knowledge, would be filled with doing the right thing all the time. No, would be filled with love, and that love comes from a pure heart, a clear conscience, and a genuine faith, which, by the way, those are the three marks of a Jesus follower's life. So many other places, Paul writes similar things about love and the source of that love, but possibly where he does it most clearly and the most definitive way that it is expressed is when he writes to a group of first century Jesus followers in the city of Corinth. And they're struggling as a church. They're fractured relationships, and they're trying to figure out what being a follower is, and there's discontent, and they're trying to live in a society that pushes back on them and has alternatives to a Christian worldview, and there's just chaos in the church and in the community, and Paul writes to them, and he wants to make it abundantly clear that there's a better way to live. In fact, this is the way he'll write it. In 1 Corinthians 12:31, he says, now, after almost 13 chapters of information and direction for you, I want you to know, I want to show you a way of life that is best of all, the very best, and here's what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to unpack that. And what Paul describes next for them, for sure, at least if you've never heard this before, if it was the first time you heard it, it would take your breath away with what he shares next. Because what he's about to do is he's about to dismantle and detonate everything that they believed they knew about what matters most in life. Everything that they're sure will bring them fulfillment and the good life is going to change in the next few moments. Everything that they have been taught and has been modeled for them for generations, Paul is going to reduce to rubble. And this is what he writes. As if to say, let me explain the very best way, and the only way I can do that is to dismantle what you think is the best way. And here we go. In 1 Corinthians 13:1, he starts it this way. If I could speak all the languages of earth and of angels. Now hold on just a second. Just think about that for a bit. How big a deal would it be if someone could speak all the languages of the world? Well, a little bit of background here. According to an organization that tracks global languages, world languages, right today, this is a recent survey, there are 7,117 languages that are spoken around the world. Every year, there are new languages that are discovered. That 7,000 number doesn't include dialects and single-person languages, kind of like I speak English. No one speaks it like me. It's like a single-person language. Now, apparently, some more information for you. To know 44 languages will get you into the Guinness Book of World Records. That's a big deal. 44 of the 7,117 will get you into the Guinness Book of World Records. So I discovered a guy by the name of Paul Janolis holds that record. That doesn't matter to you. What matters, maybe, depending what nation you're watching this from, is he's a Canadian, which totally surprised me because the Canadians that I know struggle even to pronounce English well, right? And here's this guy who knows 44 languages of the 7,000. It's a big deal. Paul writes, imagine finding someone that knows all 7,000 of them and can speak them fluently. This would be a person of great distinction. They would be wealthy. They would be sought after. They would be a desirable person to have. Imagine you're in business and you're in a global business and you find someone who can speak all the languages of the world. You have a great advantage from an international commerce point of view. Imagine international diplomacy is your thing. Governments of the world, our own government, what we would benefit from having somebody on our team that could be in a room with world leaders and understand exactly what they're saying, wouldn't have to be interpreted. This would be an amazing thing, every language of the world. Imagine the difference that could make in terms of research science and the great discoveries of the world. If you were that person, I think Paul is hinting, you would be a celebrity on earth. You would have, no doubt, the Nobel Peace Prize, and you would have humanitarian awards, and you would be sought after. Now add to that, Paul's not done here yet. Imagine you can speak all of those languages, plus you also have the ability to hear and speak the languages of angels. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know what language that is. I assume that means that you can firsthand hear, understand the words of God in first person. And you know what he's saying, and you can interpret them, and you can speak to him. You can hear, and you know exactly what God is saying. That's amazing. So Paul writes this. He says, imagine that we could do all of that, but don't really love people. Or we don't really love people who have a different political conviction than us, or we don't love people who live in a certain country of the world, or certain cities, or certain parts of our city, or our community. We don't love people of a certain sexual orientation, or ethnicity, or clothing style, or cultural preference, or skin color, and so on. And in spite of having that incredible ability, we ignore people, and we refuse to help them with our ability. Now, we use this language gift to bless ourselves, but not them. We don't make it available to anyone else unless they changed a few things about themselves and they became a little more like us, or if they cleaned themselves up a little bit or saw life from a better vantage point, like our vantage point. Imagine that you could speak all those languages and didn't love people. All those incredible gifts would never be used in the way they're intended. Paul says, you probably didn't get that supernatural ability on your own. It came from somebody else. You don't even own it. But if you don't love people, he says it's a waste. He says it's like a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. In other words, our great abilities that give us so much confidence and make us feel so good about ourselves, and others admire, and we get accolades for it, and we get some meaning from it. If they aren't fueled by love, and others end up understanding what love is by us having those exceptional abilities, it becomes annoying to people. The image that Paul might have had in mind of the noisy gong and clanging cymbal is this. Corinth was a religious center in the Roman Empire. There were lots of temples to many of the Roman gods, and they all had priests, and they had activities going on in their temples. And it would be the daily practice, and throughout the day, that groups of priests would walk through the city, and they would be in procession, beating on gongs and clanging on cymbals as a way to get the gods' attention, as if to say, hey, Jupiter, hey, Venus, look at us. We want your attention. Watch us. We're doing something great for you, and we're going to ask you for something great, so we're going to try to get your attention with this noise. We're going to make some sacrifices we want you to see. We're going to do some religious duties that'll impress you, because really what we want from you is we want some of your good stuff, Jupiter. Most everyone else, however, thought that their pious, self-serving religious practices were actually a nuisance and bothersome, because the priests in the temples were notorious for abusing women and children, who were often used in religious sexual ceremonies. They often demanded funds from citizens who were already taxed, who promised to bless them or curse them depending on what they gave. And they often interjected themselves in political life in order to manipulate to their benefit. This is annoying when that happens, and works to distance the very people in their religion that they claimed their religion was helping. What Paul seems to be saying is that it's possible for people to be really, really good at something, but they're not motivated or even use that ability to love others. It amounts to nothing of eternal value, or maybe nothing at all. It's apparently love that is the differentiator. Corinth was a cosmopolitan international city. It attracted the best of the best, the brightest of the bright, leaders in business and commerce and academics and culture and fashion and arts. And some of the most talented people lived in Corinth, in the entire Roman Empire that lived in Corinth. But, Paul writes, without love for each other, all that amounts to nothing. In fact, I guess you could say it this way: everything minus love equals nothing. So special abilities and talents without love are nothing. But look at what he says next. In the second verse of 1 Corinthians 13, he says, if I had the gift of prophecy, and if I understood all of God's secret plans, wouldn't that be cool? And possessed all knowledge, wow. And if I had such faith, get this, that I could move mountains just by asking God. Imagine that someone could see the future from God's perspective. Imagine that they could clearly explain it, and they knew exactly what God had in store for the people of the earth in the coming days and years, and they knew everything about everything. Imagine that. Imagine this. They could walk into a lab today and hand the formulation over to create a vaccine to stop COVID-19 in its tracks, because they knew that, because they know all knowledge. Better than that, they had the kind of friendship and faith with God that they could simply ask him to stop the virus, and instantly the virus would stop and people would be healed around the world. That would be amazing. It's not realistic, but it is absolutely amazing to try to imagine. Now imagine that this person can do all of that, but loves themselves more than other people, or loves his or her own family, or those that they like how they behave or enjoy being with, or like the things that they do, or they come from the same side of the tracks. They have similar values and education and family values, or they love them because they go to the same church together or in the same life group together. And so only people who get to hear the wonderful things of God are those that the person likes to be with, enjoys being with. People they feel comfortable with, because their love is limited to those they like. That's tragic. Paul can be pretty direct as he is here. He says, look, it may be possible to have these amazing faith attributes, but if you don't love, they amount to nothing. Nothing. In other words, everything minus love equals nothing. Nothing. Well, there's a third everything that Paul puts on the table. In verse 3, he says this: if I gave everything I have to the poor, and even sacrificed my body, I could boast about it. In other words, let's say that I'm a super benevolent and I'm super generous kind of person to those in need. And let's say it costs me a lot and it puts me at a disadvantage, and I sacrifice to bless someone else. I give everything away, including my health. Now, that is something, right? That is something. And it is. It really is. And people will be helped, and their lives will be improved, and it's a very, very good thing. But notice the motive that Paul points out here is so that I could boast about what I do, or take credit, or benefit in some way, rather than just be selfless, silent, unrecognized, unnoticed for the love of another person. And Paul would say, regardless of how good it is that you've done, if that's what it is, and not driven by love, you will gain nothing from it. Nothing. What a disappointment. Just another way of saying everything minus love is nothing. Or nothing plus love is everything. And then it's like Paul, in his wisdom, anticipates everyone's question that they're just waiting to ask. But what does that kind of love look like then? If it doesn't look like what I expect, what does it look like? And Paul lays it out for us. And these are the qualities in the weeks ahead we want to look at and think together about whether this is what marks our kind of love. He says in verses 4 to 7, he says things like love is patient, and it's kind, it's just, it isn't jealous, it isn't boastful, it isn't proud, it isn't rude. It rejoices when truth wins, and it doesn't keep record of wrongs. It never gives up, it never loses faith, and just some amazing qualities of what this love looks like. Qualities actually worth memorizing. That's a passage worth memorizing. And I'd encourage you to do that. It's what I'm going to do. I've done some of it, but I'm going to memorize the whole thing. But hold on, just keep this in mind for just a second. Memorizing it word for word so that you can say it at a moment's notice backwards and forwards, even in the languages of the world, without love, it's just memorized some words. It's nothing, again. So, here's the question. How does a person love like Paul describes with any kind of consistency? Day in and day out. Well, this is really important. The way that Jesus and Paul present love, it isn't what you do by direct effort. It's who you become by direct effort. It isn't an action. It isn't even well-intended actions. Love is a source of action. It's much deeper than the action itself. It's a certain way that a person thinks and experiences life that creates loving actions. Let me ask you, have you ever found yourself saying, I just can't love so-and-so? They have hurt me, they've deceived me, they lied to me, they divorced me, they fired me, they cheated on me, they betrayed me, they ignored me. Whatever it is, I just can't love that person. There's no way. To which Paul might say something like this, well, you ought not to try. Say what? You ought not to try to love that person, but you ought to try to become the kind of person who would love them, who could love them, who might love them. Our aim under love is not to act lovingly to this or that person or in this or that situation, but to become a person so possessed by love themselves that it is the only way that they could possibly think of responding. Now hold on just a second. Is Paul saying with that then, don't be patient or kind or just or humble or enduring or keep no records of wrong? Don't do that? No, he's just saying don't try to do those things. Don't try to do them. In other words, don't try to forgive those who hurt you, but try to increasingly become the kind of person who finds forgiving people increasingly easy. Don't try to be patient with the person who irritates you, but try to increasingly become the kind of person who's almost impossible to irritate. Don't try to not be offended by people's bad behavior, but become the kind of person who increasingly is unoffendable. Don't try to be someone who is nice to people who look, act, dress, speak, express their politics, worldview, sexual preferences differently from you. Don't try, but increasingly become the kind of person who, in spite of vast differences on many levels, listens, empathizes, respects, and honors these people. How is that even possible? I'm not sure I even want that to be possible. I don't know if I want to be that person. There are people I love to have on my don't love list. Well, there actually is only one primary way, and one of Jesus' guys tells us what it is. His name is John. It's his friend John once again. The one who self-describes as the one that Jesus loved. And in 1 John 4:9, this is how he says we can go about this. He starts off that verse by saying, we love each other because. Because of what? Because we're told to? Because that's what a good Jesus follower, Bible-believing person does? Because we share a common set of values? Why? Well, he finishes it this way. He says, we love each other because Jesus loved us first. You see, in order to love, we need to increasingly know that we are loved. by the divine. When we pause and do some self-reflection and grasp how we have been loved and are loved, then we find ourselves becoming love. Becoming love. Not just becoming more loving. We become love. Let me give you an example. Have you ever paused and done an inventory of all that Jesus has forgiven you of? Like reflected on that? If you actually do a serious inventory, maybe even write it down, and if you can stand it, realize that all that you have done that needs forgiveness has absolutely been wiped away, and there is no record of your wrong, just as Paul described one of the attributes of this love. You know what will happen? When you do that inventory and you realize all that has been wiped clean, you will become love, which will express itself in an ease of forgiveness because you've been forgiven of so much. If you never take the inventory, how in all the world do you become more forgiving? This would be Paul's question. Have you ever counted the second, third chances that Jesus has given you? Have you ever made an inventory of the number of times that he's answered a cry for help, or the number of times that he's helped without a cry for help? The number of times that you've received a blessing that came your way that cannot be explained by your exemplary good behavior? The good things that have come to you, the freedom that you enjoy. And now let me say this. In light of the racial tension in our land, when have you taken some time to think through how different you are from Jesus? He was not American. He did not have white skin. He did not have blue eyes and blonde hair. He did not have a college degree. He lived in relative poverty. He was a Hebrew in religious practice and diet and culture, in a Roman culture. He never traveled outside his tiny country. He did not watch CNN or Fox News and know what was going on in the world through commentators' eyes. He never once felt the shame of or the regret of sin and failing at life. He lived 2,000 years ago in a totally different world in many ways from ours before we even came on the scene. And get this. This is a quote from the scripture describing Jesus. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering, like one from whom, get this, men hide their face. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Every day, every single day from a little boy on, Jesus lived with prejudice and discrimination. Yes, because of what he taught, sure. Because of what he did, for sure. But also the unimaginable reason of his physical appearance. We're so different from him, and in so many ways. And yet, as different as we are, he came to us out of his love for us. And when you and I treat someone in less than loving ways because we do not actually love them in our hearts, and we don't have love for them, and we do that on the basis of their physical appearance and especially their skin color, do not expect Jesus to be cool with that. He knows firsthand what that feels like. And when we do that, we are on the wrong side of Jesus and the wrong side of love. So what do? Do we pick it when we see it? Sure. Yep, we do it peacefully and we do it wisely. Do we pray? Absolutely. For sure we do. Do we rethink our position and our view? Yeah, you bet. For sure we do. But here's what we do. We actually take some time every day to simply be alone with Jesus and share with him our thoughts and let him share with us his thoughts. It's how we become love. by being with love, by looking at how we're loved and how we're forgiven and what he's done for us. That's how that happens for us. And that puts a new perspective on everyone else. It means asking questions like, who do I not particularly appreciate simply because of what they believe, think, look like, where they live, how educated they are? Who is it? And bring that to Jesus and ask him what he thinks about that. And then here would be the second thing. Practice love for that person or that group of people. Do something. Jesus came into the world because he loves the world. But don't forget the first part. He came into the world. He did something. It is up to us as well. But it starts with a compelling change within us to become loved by being with the one who is love, changing our viewpoint in our world, and then acting on it and becoming love in our world. Who is going to set the pattern and the tone and the model for our culture and our world? People who have been transformed by love and become love. Jesus, you are not just loving, you are that. You are not just forgiving, you are that. You are good and gracious and kind and merciful and benevolent, but all of those stem from who you are. You are love. That's who you are. Form us into your likeness. People who love because they become love by being near to you. I pray for our country that you would not just bring peace and harmony, you would bring love into our culture. And you would get the credit for that. And your people who are being formed into your likeness would stand up and be counted for love's sake. Do that in us first, and then do it through us, but do it for your fame.